Cool. We'll get started. We've got a couple joined. Great. And then, like I said, we've got the recording available for anyone live who can check it out as well. Sorry, and the recording after the session as well. So thank you, those that are showing up live. My name's Peter Birch. For those that don't know, I'm going through for the next hour a bit of a practical session on podcasting and the hands-on getting it done type aspect and how we do things so far with Talking Health Tech and other podcasting things that I do. And so I'll be sharing the recording of this with everyone who's registered. We've got quite a few register, but quite a few also say won't be able to attend at the time. So thank you to those that have attended live. We might see some come on and come off. We're doing it as a webinar, so just drop in the comments in the chat any questions or anything as you go, and we'll stop and come to those as we need to. For those that don't know, I'm Peter Birch. I think most people looking at people's names in the chat would recognize me. And I've got a bit of a background in the healthcare space, but also done quite a fair bit in terms of community radio outside of all of this. And so I've done stuff on FBI radio and then other smaller community stations like Bankstown Auburn Community Radio and some stuff in North Ryde, so all around New South Wales. And that was all pre-podcasting for me. And that is something I've done podcasting prior to Talking Health Tech. Not sure if I've decided whether I want to release to everybody those early day podcasts that we've done, but I'll have to do that at some point. But today we're talking about podcasting. So look, if you're attending this webinar, you probably know something about podcasts and why they're important, but just to reiterate, and sometimes it's helpful to be able to put that business case across if you're within a business looking at starting a podcast, that, why podcasting is such a good medium. A lot of people in Australia and in the world are aware of podcasts now when they would listen to them. It's a highly engaging medium. You literally get to be in the ear of the person that you're speaking to. They continue to become popular through even pandemic. Sure, maybe the pandemic helped. Everyone's, interested in getting involved in podcasting. But at the same time, I know of a lot of podcasters kind of struggled a bit during the pandemic because people weren't commuting. Because the thing that, you can listen while you're doing other things. Often people would listen on a drive or on the train, but a lot of people are listening on their daily walk on a podcast or, do like folding the washing and other bits and pieces. So drop in the chat if you're attending live and let us know where you're listening to your podcast. And I can see Oliver's mentioned, listening to podcasts less when you're not commuting, because it's not something that people sit down and they do. It's kind of something you do while you're doing something else when you're listening to it. What's great about them as well is that it can be something that you do on the side with no real intention to have any kind of business around it whatsoever, or it could be a full-fledged business in and of itself. So I can explore some of those options during this session too. One of the standout ones that we'd all be familiar with is Joe Rogan. And about 12 months ago, I think probably more now, it'd be longer than that, but it sold his podcast to Spotify for $100 million plus. It wasn't confirmed the amount, but that's what it's estimated to be. That's by far not the standard, but that was a deal that means, he's only on Spotify and a few other exclusivity things. They say that he's got full control as well, but I don't know how that'll go. But Spotify is very much all in terms of podcasts, and the other platforms are definitely following suit in terms of investing in content specific for their platforms. An interesting space to just watch and be part of and see how it all grows. So it's an emerging medium. If you're interested in starting a podcast, you've probably asked one of these questions at some point, and I'm not going to be able to answer every single question here, but this is literally just off the top of my head, and also just noting down when people ask me questions about podcasting, the common questions that I get asked, or like the things that they want to talk about, and there's everything in there. So like I said, it can be a bit overwhelming and confusing, and that happens to a lot of people. Is that it makes sense to do a podcast, but then kind of like where you start, and you have that confused face gif going on. So just before I get into what we're going to cover today, something that's a term that I'll use every now and then is pod fading. And that's the concept of starting a podcast and then stopping after a little bit. And it's really common because even though there are over 2 million podcasts on any podcast player today, 75% of them haven't got current content in them. So many people don't even get involved in podcasting. So it's like, well, it's already a saturated market. I missed that opportunity. A lot of people start and then they don't follow through. And that's for a number of reasons that we can get into. But there's a lot of dormant podcasts out there where they've done 7 or 8 episodes and they've gone, I'm finishing up. Sometimes podcasts do have a start and a stop, and that's it. But often they're ongoing, or sometimes they have start and stop. You do a season, you'll come back. But a lot of people start and they've never come back. So today I'm going to talk about, we're going to go up until 4 o'clock Sydney time. It's 3:10 now. So for the next 50 minutes, we're we're going to be going through, and this session will be available for the recording will be available afterwards as well. So I might go a bit quick in some parts, but do drop a question in the Q&A section if you want to jump into something at the end, or in the chat as well if you've got any feedback as we go. And take a sip of my beverage while you look at this. It's not coffee, but it's a matcha because it helps regulate my caffeine, according to my wife. Okay, so show format. The first thing you want to think about when you're putting together a podcast is what format will it be in? Because, some people will listen, like you could be thinking, we talked about what some of our favorite podcasts are at the start of this session. And some people will be familiar with the Talking Health Tech podcast. It's quite a standard interview style that we do. We also have a premium feed where we would do a bonus episode every week. And a lot of those bonus episodes are like a monologue style, a solo episode where it's me just talking about something for a bit. But there are also podcasts where it could be just conversational podcasts where it's a bunch of people just chatting about things. That's what it feels like. It feels like you're just a fly on the wall in that conversation. There are panel style interviews, like where it's like a panel webinar, but in a more of a multiple people in it. The non-fictional storytelling ones are really interesting. And we did some work with MScan and basically launched their podcast from start to finish as Talking Health Tech. And that was done more in the style of, I guess, a bit of a blend between interviews and storytelling. There's this third person element. So do check it. It's just a free podcast you can listen to, the Spot On podcast. It's about raising awareness for an education for those that have undergone a treatment for a treatment or diagnosis for skin cancer. And so I'm narrating that podcast episode, and we recorded some interviews, but I really like the style and the dynamic of that. I'm listening to a lot of podcasts that are kind of in that style. There's a lot of those true crime ones that are kind of like that too, that people get really into. There's also the storytelling ones, like there's just like a book, but kind of in a podcast. So that's an interesting one. A lot of businesses will try and do repurpose content and then do them as podcast episodes. Sometimes we've repurposed our own bits of webinars or live streams and put them into a podcast. I'm wary of doing that all the time though, because sometimes whilst that's good and handy to be able to repurpose content into a podcast, it wasn't originally recorded for a podcast. So it doesn't always sound amazing. But maybe you can take snippets from and then turn them into a podcast episode. But to be fair, you can blend any different type of style, and the best way is listen to podcasts and get some motivation, inspiration from other shows, and maybe blend it all together to be something that you and your niche of a target will really appreciate. Like, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, and you could, like any kind of story, there's the concept of a story arc, the beginning, middle, and end. Think about how you're kind of structuring your shows, and that's how you might, come together with a good episode. It's like how we tell a story anyway to somebody. So the usual concepts apply. This is stuff that people, I imagine, are kind of interested in. Well, I get a lot of questions about what recording equipment we use. So that's the start, is like once you've determined what structure the show is going to be in, you then need to actually record some audio. So you need obviously a microphone, you need headphones, you need something to record it onto, a device. You then need to put storage in that device, and you need somewhere to record it. So I'm going to go into each of those in a second. I'm mildly prepared here. So if you do ever want to purchase any of these items and see each of these, then in the chat, I've got affiliate links that I've created. So this is literally all the stuff that I use, and I like using it. So if you wanted to use the same, and if you buy off one of those links, then I get like nothing cut for that, but it's there if you wanted to use it. You can also use that information to then look at other ones, but that's something there. There's also some software links to software affiliate links too for the software that we use to do things. So do check that out. But let's go through each one here. So this is my gear when it arrived. When I first started, I went all out because I wouldn't recommend that all the time, but Rode like me. So Rode, I've got good packages these days for podcasts. This is back in 2018. I purchased this stuff, and I think the pricing is about the same, but I ended up buying 4 Procaster microphones, and this is the same. This is one of those ones here, and they come separately with a little fluffy thing that goes on the end there. You also need to get, like I do have these desk stand ones, so you can put a stand on your desk. I then upgraded, I guess, to these boom arm type versions where it doesn't take up any room on the table, but it kind of hangs over like this, but it makes you look pretty serious. So I've got both of those. The Rodecaster Pro is super cool for recording multiple microphones at once and putting it into one panel. This is quite portable, but you do need to plug it into some electricity to be able to run it. So I actually use a portable thing as well if I'm doing more like on field type stuff. But also these shock mounts too, they're separate as well. So this bit's here where if you move the microphone around, it helps it stay in place and doesn't bong when you hit the desk. Then that's kind of the setup that I've got here. That's if you're going all out. However, when I do podcast recording with guests, they're like, well, what microphone should I use? I do want to buy one. What should I get? Oh, by the way, that's my setup in a different way. You've got the stand and the shock mount and the microphone and the fluffy thing and the microphone. So in terms of pricing, like that microphone is anywhere from $150 to $250. So I've got 4 of them, but I often recommend this one. Apparently you can buy them from Officeworks as well, but there's a link in that thing. People ask me what microphone I should get, like that you should get. These can plug straight into USB. They've got a cable for USB plug, so you don't have to muck around with multiple plugs. And many of the episodes where you hear a good quality guest, they're usually using a Blue Yeti mic. So that's the one that most people kind of land with. And you can have it kind of sitting down the bottom and you don't look like it's not intrusive, and you can use it for Zoom calls and stuff like that afterwards if you wanted to. I use these ones. I've got white ones and black ones because I think the white ones look cool. Probably didn't need to buy 2, but I've got 2 pairs. So, but look, in terms of headphones, it is important to have headphones. I don't have like ones with a microphone on it because that seems redundant. I know some people who use gamer ones. I don't really like the sound of the gamer microphones because they sound a bit tinny, but they're okay. Often, like as an alternative to having a microphone, honestly, the $20 USB headsets that you can buy, again, from Officeworks, probably, they actually sound pretty good. So they're even better than AirPods. So I would not use AirPods, and I always recommend against using AirPods for podcast recording. And any type of Bluetooth recording headphones. A lot of people like to use the overhead ones, and they're fantastic for listening to things, but the microphones are pretty average. I also recommend these over the AirPods. The old Apple headphones where they'd be completely straight, but then you look away and you look back and they've all of a sudden gone like that. They are better for podcast recording than AirPods because anything that's got a cable on it generally is better than Bluetooth. So that's my hot tip for anyone. And that's what I recommend for those recording. The other thing I use, hopefully I can move it without unplugging everything, but there's a Zoom H5. You can see that in the bottom of my screen there. So that's on right now. That's where I'm using this big microphone, but it's got a cable like that at the end of it, right? There's no USB connection for it. So you kind of have to run it through another thing to allow it to then have a USB output. So I use this now just as a kind of converter for the microphone. But what I also use the H5 for, the Zoom H5, so there's no relation to Zoom, the platform, the Zoom H5, I use that for out in the field recording. And I've not done a great deal of that in the past 18 months, but we'll get back into doing that, recording at events. You can see it's got little microphones and you can plug this thing off and you can put a different microphone on and you can put a little fluffy thing on it. You can do a boom type or like different type of microphone on top of it. And so like if you listen to way back, the episode with Michelle Perugini from Presigen, that was really on the place. We recorded that out the front of an event, and it was 2 of these microphones plugged into one of those, and it sounds awesome. So, and the first, I think, 50 episodes of the podcast were recorded with one of these things and 2 of these microphones. So I often recommend, this is like if you're getting really serious, then you like buttons and stuff, but often a Zoom H5, and you can get now, I think they're up to, I don't know, H8 or something, like they keep putting the numbers up. H5 is, if you Google around and everything, everyone will say get an H5. So this one I recommend to a lot of people, and there's a link in there if you want it. This is handy for doing live stream stuff if that's your jam. Like you can play sounds. I don't use it for those that have recorded interviews with me, we used to record with these as the sound kind of like a radio show, but you don't really need to, and it's better in post-production to add them in anyway. But this is super handy. It's got a Bluetooth connection for phones, so you could have someone who called in and then it just Bluetooth connects to that, and then you've got them as another channel and it records all the audio in separate channels. So this one's handy for that, but it doesn't sound as great if they're coming off the phone. So you want to plug this into your computer and then use something else to record on, which we'll get into in a sec. How are we going? Good. That's a good start. Drop a message in the chat if you've got any questions about it, but we'll keep going. You need to store it on something, obviously, when you record it. I've tried everything of recording direct onto a piece of software on the computer, recording it onto an SD card, and then also recording it onto a third-party thing. The best kind of happy medium I've got now is I always record in 2 places at once. So on the Rodecaster Pro, this thing, you can put an SD card into it and press the big record button. So I do that. But then also I record on Squadcast, which is what I use to record the podcast episodes, which I'll show you in a sec. So then that way I've got it in 2 places, because once in every 20, 30 episodes, one of them will go wrong. So it's always handy having a redundancy. So that's the reason for the cloud picture. Like some of these solutions like Zoom, they've got a cloud recording where you can record locally. I'll get into that in a sec. I think that's next. Yes. So I've used Zoom a lot in the past, in the early days, to record podcast episodes. Well, actually, in the first 20, 30 episodes of Talking Health Tech, they were all in person in a studio. I see Jeff's on. Jeff's been in there too. So he's been in that studio, although it was a room that wasn't, overly soundproof. We'll talk about rooms in a second. But the majority of recordings these days that you'll hear on Talking Health Tech and other things we do is on Squadcast. There are other platforms like Squadcast, Riverside, and other ones that do this. Their big kind of thing is being able to record the audio locally and then load it up into the cloud, rather than doing what Zoom does, which is the audio goes up into the cloud and then it records from here. So that means that if your guest has bad internet or it gets all choppy, all of that will come through in the recording. Whereas on Squadcast, it records it as if they press record on their device here and then loads it up, which is kind of nice. So it doesn't sound, if it sounds a bit average when you're recording it, actually at the time, it sounds a lot better when you download the recording. But we're like, they're a startup like any startup. Sometimes it's not reliable. Sometimes the audio settings aren't quite right. And everyone, sometimes I'll just refer back to Zoom. So if you're just getting started, I used the free Zoom for quite a while, because often on the free Zoom, you can record, I think just if it's one-on-one, there's no time limit, you can record. There's a setting within Zoom I recommend everyone to use under the preferences, under audio, where you can record the audio in 2 separate tracks, which is really handy for recording. Because if you think about it, you don't want to have just one audio recording, because then if someone has a dog or coughs or anything, you want to be able to mute that one while the other one's talking. So just make sure you change that in Zoom if you do use that, to get 2 separate audio recordings. Squadcast also lets you record video, or you can choose not to, but we don't record video anymore. Place to record. I get the best quality recordings, and most of the recordings we do now for Talking Health Tech are in there, and that's a walk-in wardrobe. And it looks kind of similar to that. Actually, it probably looks a little bit cleaner than that, but recording in a small space. So especially when you're doing virtual recordings, a lot of people kind of default and they think, I'll record it in the boardroom, or I'll record it somewhere it looks nice. But the boardroom, it sounds like you're recording in a bathroom. And, especially if you're using Bluetooth headphones. So you got to find somewhere that's small, it's padded with a lot of stuff. I know a lot of audio, voice producers that like to record in their car with a bunch of pillows and blankets. That's why a walk-in wardrobe is really good. So yeah, but then if we do a live stream, I'm going to, you might have seen on LinkedIn or socials, I'll record it here. I haven't even closed that window. Actually, that's not great. But there's a bit you can do in post-production to clean up some things these days, but you don't want to rely on post-production. You want to make sure you've got a quiet space, good internet. And I've really found closing other apps on your computer as well makes a difference too, because it can create lag and delay. So that's important. And it's always annoying when you hear people ding during an interview. So make sure you put yourself on do not disturb or turn your phone off. They're the basic kind of thing. Editing. So for a long time, and actually I still occasionally will pull out Audacity, because I'm a Mac user. It's a free tool. I don't think they have Audacity for PC, but I'm sure there's free audio tools. But that's the one that I've used for a long time. It's basic. It's okay. It's been I think for the first 60 episodes, all of them were edited by me in Audacity. We've got a team now and we do a lot of that, but we all use Descript now. And in that link, I will have an affiliate link in there. I just can't find it at the moment. So, but I say this to a lot of people, is that their sales video on their website is my favorite sales video. So it's pretty amazing software. You can even create an AI version of your voice. And that's what's in Descript. You just need to train it, which is pretty wild. We've only used it as a joke on the show. I've never really planned to use it for real. But it's also got a lot of good features, like being able to automatically find filler words and then remove them. So the ums, ahs, likes, and your knows, and also reduce gaps down to a certain amount. It's used some clever AI. You don't want to go too hard on that because it can sound, disjointed. You've got to find a good happy medium. It also has some pretty cool tech to be able to do all of that audio processing in a single click. So if you don't know about compression and all the different mastering things and how to remove some of the echo and room noise, in the good old days, you used to have to kind of understand a lot of that audio production stuff. Descript, again, using AI, wonders of tech. Hey, you can click a button, which they use Studio Sound. They only just recently released it, and then it just kind of takes relatively average audio and it brings it to the front, removes a lot of background noise. And actually, Squadcasts do something similar as well. So a lot of these newer tools, they do a lot of automatic processing. Just be mindful that if you do too much audio processing or audio processing in multiple places, it can sound too processed. So you can dial back some of the Descript stuff. But if you've got a decent microphone, you shouldn't need to use a lot of this kind of stuff. I rely on the Descript kind of processing stuff if I'm in a hurry and the guest has got a really average mic or some really bad like noise, or they were outside or something like that. So, but sometimes I'll just revert back to the old traditional audio processing capabilities too. I'm hoping this is helpful, guys, because it's kind of just really practical hands-on things about my experiences, and that's really the purpose of this session, and also to see what people are really interested when it comes to podcasting as well. There's a lot of podcast hosts. Hey, like you can listen to a podcast on a lot of different platforms, and often people are like, when you launch a podcast, how do you put it on all of these things? So there's two things. There's a host, and then there's a player, and most hosting platforms also have players. Most people listen to podcasts on like Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Google. They're usually the big three that you would promote on your website. I see a lot of podcasts that have like a button thing like this and like, hey, everyone, listen on the, I don't know what, the Castos app or the Outbox. I don't know what they are. You're pretty safe just promoting Apple and Spotify and Google. For Talking Health Tech, I think it's 67% of listeners listen on Apple Podcasts. So you get stats from your podcast host, which I'll talk about in a sec, on like what people are listening on. We use Podbean as our host. I like Podbean. At the same time, I don't like how much they try and push their branding on things. So we pay for like a higher tier, which removes a lot of the branding, but they still try and bring people back to the Podbean website. You know, if you click on the player on our website, for example, it'll take you back to the Podbean site, which is I'm kind of an all branding type guy. So that mildly annoys me. That said, they've got some great functionality in terms of dynamic insertion of advertisements. So, you know, if you're looking at having advertisements or sponsors on your podcast, you can inject them at different points, a pre-roll ad, mid-roll ad, and a post-roll ad, and you can choose where you want to put them. And then also you can manage it centrally. And if you've got multiple shows, you can put on different shows. You can geocode. Like there's a lot of cool stuff you can do so that people who are listening in the US could listen to one ad, or even down to states. People listening in Victoria, if there's an event happening, they could get that ad. And so you can insert an ad into previous episodes as well. So if people are listening to an episode from 3 years ago, they can hear an ad for something that's coming up next week, and then you can take it out, rather than baking in an ad into a recording and then that's in there forever. So we use some of that functionality on Talking Health Tech in Podbean. And Podbean are the only one that do that, but they also have some other functionality which we like too. I would prefer, like there's other things they do like white labeled apps and premium feeds. We don't use them for our premium feed. I can talk about premium podcast feeds later. It's not within this one, but happy to talk more about it later. Just conscious of time, and I want to allow some time for Q&A as well at the end. Promoting your podcast. So far what we've done, we've recorded it, we've put it up on a host. So sorry, that's the bit that I missed. So you need a podcast host, and we host on Podbean. So it's where you load up your podcast, the audio, and it's kind of like doing a blog post on Podbean. You load up your image. If you've got advertising, not everyone does it, but for us, we select where the ad goes. Then you write other bits and pieces, and you just schedule it. Really, that's it. You've got to set it up as well within Podbean or your host to then connect to all these different players. And the better ones, most of them these days have a way to centrally manage it and onboard you through that process. Sometimes it involves you've got to like that once-off kind of thing where you've got to click into Spotify and set up a thing and then link it back to yours. So that initial setup can take some time. Occasionally they break, but generally it's pretty easy. Where it gets messy is if you ever change your RSS feed. So every podcast has an RSS feed. Some people will be familiar with RSS feeds for anything on the internet really, but every podcast has an RSS feed, and that's where you get your podcast host gives you your RSS feed, and you load that, and you can link that feed to all the players. A lot of these players aggregate off the back of Apple Podcasts too. So once you connect to Apple Podcasts, there's a lot of them that just then sync up with that. So it's not like you have to connect with all of these. Apple seems to be the one that brings them all together. I can go into more about hosting later if needed. Promoting your podcast. There's loads of ways you could promote a podcast. And one that we used to do a bit of, and now we're just getting back to, you'll see a lot more of it on socials these days, is audiograms. Something I'm a bit of a fan of. And audiograms we're not the first people to do it or anything. There's platforms that let you do audiograms. What is an audiogram? Given that a podcast is all audio, obviously, you may not record the video, and they might be 1 hour long, however long. You're not going to post that on social media to give people listen. Everyone's all about, I just want to know 60 seconds or whatever it is. I'm like, yeah, tell me a little piece of this episode. What should I be interested in? So Headline is a neat app that does the little wave filey things. While people are talking, it automatically does it. I've actually got an example coming up in a second, which then you can share on social media. It's a neat way to then promote the show. Other things we do is, you'll notice on the Talking Health Tech website, we have a post for every episode, and there's like a longer article that we write, which we've experimented with transcription. By the way, if you're interested in transcription, I can talk about that, but Descript do that really well as well. But just back to that in a second. We've tried transcription, we've tried summary articles, we've tried, key takeaways, and we've kind of landed on a happy medium now. We also link on our website, internally link on our website to other relevant content. There's a bit of an SEO play there, but having a place for people to go on the website to listen is handy. People ask me, do I really need a website for my podcast? My recommendation is yes, not because heaps of people will listen from there, but often people will see it and then probably listen on something else. So it's kind of like the place for everyone to go. Because if you think about sharing your podcast on social media, and if you're on Apple and Spotify and Google and all of them, like which link do you share? And Podbean also create a page for you, but sometimes they're a bit, I don't know, they've got the Podbean branding in it and things. And you can do like a unique URL for those. But then what if you wanted to add other stuff on your website too? So your podcast host lets you have little embed codes that for each episode that you've done, you can then extract a little, like an HTML, like iframe code, which then you can put on your blog posts and have a little player on your thing, and then write an article. And that gives each podcast episode a link to go to. And then you might have your links on your website, which are, hey, click here to subscribe on Apple or Google or whatever. Having guests on your podcast is a great way to grow organically. They'll share it. They'll get other people interested. Not every single person who listens to a podcast episode from a guest is going to listen to your podcast ongoing. But if the guest brought 100 listeners and 10 stay on and keep listening to your show, then that's great. And there is actually retention stats you can view within Podbean and things. But again, it's not as reliable, because when people listen on their own podcast player, there's a little bit of the stats and the visibility you get aren't as great as you get through other things like social media or YouTube and things, because the audio downloads onto the device. And after that, you don't really get too much more insights, which is a bit annoying. But you speak to podcasters within the space, and that's one thing that people often talk about is better view and analytics would be fantastic. Anyway, word of mouth is obviously a good thing with podcasting. It's a slow game. I can think of a handful of conversations I've had in the past 12 months where people launched a podcast and they didn't get heaps of listeners, so they stopped. It takes a while. It's not something that you're going to get like a lot of traction very quickly. But people do go back and they listen to back catalogs. So don't feel like if you start a podcast and you only get 3 people listening and one of them's your mum, then, that episode might be listened to again in 12 months. Also, you might not want people to listen to it in 12 months' time. I listened to the first couple of episodes that we did. I just sound like I'm trying to be somebody else, or it's a little bit different. It sounds like me, but it doesn't. But everyone says the same thing. You got to get those first episodes out of the way. That's my general kind of advice. Just get started and have a crack. Don't rely on the algorithm, because there's loads of people like, how many episodes should I do? And how do I get on new and noteworthy on Apple Podcasts? And people say there's an algorithm and they've cracked it. They haven't. Like a lot of Apple new and noteworthy. So when you launch a new podcast, everyone talks about, how do I get on new and noteworthy? Because that's where Apple will promote it to people. Even if you do get on new and noteworthy, it doesn't mean that your podcast is going to go gangbusters. Look, it's like anything. It's kind of like SEO and a website. There's some basic things you can do, but at the same time, if you're solely determining your success based on whether you can follow this recipe of an algorithm that you don't actually know whether it works or not, I'd focus more on the content and the quality of it, and building your audience and community first would be the best way, rather than getting too bogged down in all this, because you can run yourself in circles. I was worried who that was for a second. So, that's one of the examples of the audiograms we've done for one of our clients, MScan, that was then shared on social media. We featured a prominent dermatologist in the space talking about things. It's a great platform for patient engagement, as an aside. And so we put together that just with one of those things, and can tailor them quite specifically as well by pulling in a few other different graphics as well. Also sharing on socials, you get some good traction. Sometimes it's hit and miss, depends on how much a guest will share what you do, and then the algorithm says yes, and then you'll get more kind of traction. But that, the number of views and likes on social media don't necessarily convert to downloads on your podcast. It's just, you got to keep playing that game. That's generally the thing, and stay consistent. If I was going to get to some general advice, which I will at the end. Launching, look, there's the general advice, and I talked about the algorithm for a second there, but this isn't even about the algorithm. This is just about generally what people expect these days. You can do trailer episodes of podcasts, and that's a neat way when you're launching your podcast. Have a like a trailer for a movie or whatever. You've got your 2-minute, like high level kind of summary, something that you record specifically as your, hey, this podcast is coming soon. This is what you can expect. And this is when it launches. And you can have different trailer episodes throughout too. So, that reminds me, we should probably do a new trailer episode for Talking Health Tech about, what's happening in 2022 or, other bits and pieces. Because usually the trailer episode sits at the top and is the first thing that people listen to. And I usually recommend launching your trailer episode first and then connecting to all the things, because it takes a couple of days for Apple Podcasts and Spotify and everyone to connect. And that gives you that kind of ability to soft launch and make sure it all works and search and see that it's there. And then have 3 or 5 episodes ready to go. 3 to 5 when you launch. So don't just launch one podcast episode. Give something that people can kind of binge back on. That's usually well received. And the theory is the algorithm likes this, but that's not really why I'm saying. I'm saying it because then it helps you get into, gives you a sense of what's going to be involved as well in terms of time and effort, and you get a good feel. So rather than just releasing one and seeing how it goes, have a plan about, am I releasing fortnightly, monthly, weekly, daily? How often am I going to be releasing that? You could do ongoing, episodes continually, like we do Talking Health Tech. You can do seasons. So seasons of like we did for the Spot On podcast, we did 4 episodes, and then, you kind of set the expectation at the end. It's like, hey, get ready for season 2. It's coming in December. And so people are kind of like, if they did just stumble across it, they see, hey, they got season 2 coming up soon, so I'll subscribe. You can also have podcasts that kind of work in almost like a sequential order, like you have to listen to them in this order. And you can also do them as just, they make sense whenever you listen to them. So there's a bit you can control within the host to help you structure it. I mentioned allow time to connect to all the different things. And don't expect that big bang. There might be a gradual kind of lift up of your podcast. Monetizing. We've got 20 minutes left and we can allow 10 minutes for questions at the end. Monetizing a podcast. When I started, I had no intentions of monetizing Talking Health Tech at all. I kind of did it as an opportunity to put those conversations that I'm already having in the industry out to more people, because it seemed really interesting. And that's still why I do it today. But there's now a business model around it. And there's a lot more that we do other than just the podcast these days. But there's still, I've explored every single one of these, and we don't do every single one of these tools, but I can talk about each of them in depth, about my experiences with them, what I've learned from them. Advertising and sponsorship. We run ads in the Talking Health Tech podcast. We have, that's what I mentioned, the pre-roll, mid-roll, post-roll advertisements. There are podcasts that do a lot of paid appearances, so you have to pay to come on the show. We do some promotion type work with some of the larger organizations where they're like, we want to be able to come on multiple times in the year. It's something we've tried to do we've been really careful of with Talking Health Tech, is making sure it's not a pay for play type thing. So if someone's genuinely got a good story to tell, then whether they're a member or not of Talking Health Tech is kind of irrelevant. If it's a good story, then we'll do that. Then people will become members if they see it is of value. But then there are some other organizations that are big. They're like, hey, these are quite different stories we'd like to tell. Can we do that? We've only got so many episodes to use. So that's where we'll do a kind of deal with some of these companies. So essentially they are paid, but at the same time, I probably would run, their conversation anyway. So it's a win-win type scenario. And we work with them about what that content will be. And it's in their interest too, that it's not coming across as overly salesy and infomercially as well. So that's something that we continually work on, but it's possible to do. Affiliate sales, we don't do, I've literally just started this affiliate link thing, but I don't expect anything off the back of it. But a lot of podcasts, especially in the States, when they've got a large volume of listeners, will do affiliate marketing. So they'll run ads and not charge the company, but then they'll be like, click on this link / blah. And every time they get a clip of the ticket every time someone buys off that. So you can do that if you've got some good volume. Some podcasts, it's quite common. Podcasts use things like Patreon and, what is it? buymeacoffee.com or something. So many different little ways to get donations, one-time kind of things. That's really just about helping a creator do their thing. We have a premium podcast feed with Talking Health Tech. So it gives a private RSS feed that is, I like this concept. I think it's cool. We use a platform called Supercast to do our premium feed. There are others as well, but I like the Supercast guys. It's a relatively new organization, but allows you to then have a separate RSS feed for, the people who subscribe to it. And then you can actually tailor the premium feed a little bit like a newsletter, not to the same degree, but you can do a lot of those variable kind of fields. Like you could put their name in the subject line. You can add additional episodes that aren't on your public feed because it's not related. So the way we do it, we do episodes 2 weeks earlier than the public feed. We don't do the ads in the premium feed, but we do in the public feed. And we do an extra bonus episode on the premium feed as well. You can, like, Supercast allow you to, like, they've got their own paywall. You can do direct with them, but they also allow you to do it in kind of a bundled way, which we do. We also have a community platform. That's a good way to engage with your listeners, is run a community, whether it's a free one on Facebook or whatever, or you can do a paid thing, which we've kind of bundled everything we do together in a community kind of package, I guess, where we've then got a community forum and we'll engage with our community about the content that should be on there. It's a neat way to get a gauge from those that are, actively listening and have a little bit of skin in the game, interested in what's going on. That helps feed the quality of the content too. So it's win-win. So I really like that model of the community aspect of monetizing a podcast. Something I want to call out too is if you Google how much money can I make from a podcast, probably would have come across, I don't know if you have to Google that exact, I don't think I've Googled that one exactly, but that kind of thing is, you'll come across CPM, which is cost per mille, cost per 1,000 listeners. And that concept again is familiar in other things as well, not just podcasting. But you'll see here, like, the industry norms are, $25 to, like 60-second ad if you've got 1,000 listeners or something. So that's how much you can make, $25 if you ran an ad and you've got 1,000 people listening to it. And it's like, that's not a great deal of money. And so that works really well for Tim Ferriss and other kind of large organizations. And when you're dealing with organizations that do this type of, like, they're advertising organizations, institutions that run podcast ads and they advertise the big companies. But if you're in a niche area and you've got a captive audience and an audience that an organization will want to access, and they know, like, and trust you, then the amount that you charge is up to you. That's like anything. It's how much the market is willing to pay. So do some work in terms of don't be, my call out here is, don't feel like you need to be constrained to this unless you are trying to deal directly with these advertising people. But yes, that's how much they're going to say if you wanted them to inject these random ads and you don't want to go out to companies. But if you've got direct relationships with companies, you can come up with any kind of model and any kind of business and say, hey, this is how we'll do ads. And it's up to you. Podcasting. People ask me how much time I need for a podcast. Dead set. If you're doing it yourself, probably takes about 25 hours in total to set the whole thing up from start to finish. And ongoing, if you're wanting to do it well, allow a bit more than a day a week. So that usually puts a lot of people off. You could do less, but like anything, the more time and effort you put into the planning, the better it will be. That said, also, if you can put a lot of time and effort into something, and if you're not really into it, you can be spinning your wheels. So sometimes it's good to get help from people who do this more often. We do offer, post-production services through Talking Health Tech for organizations, offer the full kind of package of creating podcasts, like I said. So that's something that we've got a few conversations going, which is not something that I originally expected to occur when I started the podcast. Like I said, it wasn't intended to be a business in the first place, but it's such a good platform, particularly in the health space, because, not even the B2B side, but you've got patients who are, in particular niche areas of whether it's disease or illness or concern, and also carers for patients in those areas. And then organizations or interested bodies, institutions that then want to engage them and have quality content available to people, even if they're not, directly dealing with clinicians. And it's the ability to bring on the best in breed into, like, these consumable things that anyone can access. And I know of clinicians in our own community who start to recommend podcasts to patients of extra things they can be doing, like reputable sources of information. So having a podcast in your arsenal, from putting your marketing hat on for a second, can be really valuable in that respect, even in a B2C sense. So that's some of the conversations we've had with a few organizations these days. In summary, I feel like I covered some of this, but these like just generally as well. I mentioned before, do the planning, but also don't overcook it. Just get in and do it. Sometimes that's the best way, depending on what you're doing. Choose something that you're passionate about, because you can get, so if you don't like the topic, it'd be really rough. Have some realistic expectations. It's a long game. It's not direct lead conversion. Every time someone listens to a podcast, it's not like running website ads. It's a bit more kind of top of funnel. There's a lot of good free tools out there. So, all of the supercasts and extra tools and things that I mentioned, they're good if you add on in time and all the kind of fancy stuff. I got mine up front because that's the kind of person I am, but you don't need to. If that is overwhelming, you technically can record with a phone or a laptop, but there's a good middle ground. Some of those tools like that, Blue Yeti mic, choosing a good room, having a decent internet connection, doing it on Zoom is fine. And that doesn't really set you back that much. Trial and error, be a tinkerer, tinker with the thing, be prepared to get in and get your hands dirty, get feedback as you go, because that helps you. You're doing it for people to listen to you. So you can engage directly with your listener base and find out what they like. We didn't put any kind of monetization around talking health tech for, I think, over 12 months, and it kind of just came organically. It wasn't something we were pushing to do. So build that audience first before you even think about doing any of the monetization side. You can have a really small listener base, but have a lot of influence in that space. So don't be discouraged by this. Like I still kind of, you get that initial feel like where I'm engaging in podcast communities and things where people get hundreds of thousands of listeners, and we don't get 100,000 listeners a week on Talking Health Tech. But there aren't probably 100,000 people that I want to reach with the podcast. There might only be 10. There's more than 10, but there's, it's not about the volume, it's the quality that should be the focus. And don't feel like you just have to pump ads in your podcast to be able to monetize the podcast. There are ways that you can, cover your costs or even do more things, have a neat little side business by having the podcast at the center of what you do. A lot of people use the podcast as well to then generate more business for their core kind of thing that they do. That's the more typical approach as well to people. So if you want to connect with me, talk about podcasting, please do. I'd love to know where you're at with your podcast journey. Book a time. So I'll put the little link in the chat to now, so you can click on that for those that are attending live. We do everything from full podcast production services through to some post-production, just like specific projects that we can do. We leverage the fact that we've recorded over 200 episodes, got all the gear, got some idea, and particularly in the healthcare space too, starting to build those networks to be able to promote them effectively as well. So happy to chat with anyone about podcasting. I just love to talk about it anyway. So happy to bounce ideas if you've got them. So schedule a catch up if you like. Opening the floor to any Q&A as well. It's in webinar form, guys. So you'll have to write it in. You could use the Q&A section or just the chat, or give me any feedback or comments. Happy to talk about any of what I've covered. And there is also going to be a survey that's sent out afterwards too. It's not long, 3 questions, I think. So please do complete that if you've attended live or you have any feedback about it. I'll give another 1 or 2 minutes for anyone to put any questions. I can see a couple coming through. Great. Yeah, this is the thing. Like Oliver mentioned, it's just really at idea stage. So being aware of what's available is always good. I can see Simon has asked stats. Yeah. Yes. So the question that Simon's asked is about, does it do a good job of pulling stats together from multiple channels that people will listen to for an episode? So, yes, it does. You go into Podbean, for example, and you go to the stats section. Podbean does actually do some pretty good stats compared to a lot of other platforms. But I think most platforms these days will then break down what player people listen from. So whether it's the Podbean player, they try and push everyone to that. But that's where we know that there's 67% of people listen on Apple Podcasts. You can break it down to country, and then you can export it into a CSV or whatever, and then crunch it further if you want. We don't really do that too much. The stats I look at on a regular basis are there's the separate advertising tool within Podbean as well, where you can see the number of impressions that an ad has had. But also separately, you can then look at, for episodes, how many downloads it had, split by different podcast players, whether it was on the website or whether it was on a player. They've got tools like retention tools as well, where you can see how much of an episode someone's listened to, but it's very much grain of salt stuff, because when you look at that on Podbean, I think you need to have we've got the highest plan with them now. and you have to have that high plan to be able to access that. When you do that, it only tells you, like, it gives you that kind of stat that you can see on a lot of other tools like YouTube and LinkedIn and stuff, where you can see where people drop off, but it only tells you on Podbean that number for people who listened on the Podbean player, which isn't that many, but often that's the website. However, you can get that same data from when you go into Apple and see how many people who listened on Apple Podcasts, where they dropped off. And you can also do that in Spotify now too. So you can kind of, there's a couple of clicks and you have to do. Now, I don't totally understand how that works, given that you download them onto a device. So it's kind of grain of salt stuff for me. I look at it as a bit of a gauge. I typically see people will start to drop off at around 10 minutes of an episode. And I've heard a lot of people talk about that too. 10 minutes is usually the point in which people start to drop off. But even then, like, that's when you go, we have people go at about 80%. 80% people stay on till about 10%. And then by the end, it's about 60% retention, which is still really high compared to other tools, like things like YouTube and things. But podcast is a kind of tool that people can listen to in between things and in the background. So yeah, so you can get that. We don't use another tool. Like, there are other third-party tools that let you do additional stats if you do stuff to the RSS feed. I don't like playing with the RSS feed because I've done that once and then it all broke and then it was a bitch to clean up. But yeah, the tools from Podbean are generally pretty good for stats. We've got another couple of minutes. If anyone else has got any other questions, we'll have the recording of this available to anybody as well. You can watch this. I'm going to round out here, I think, guys. Unless someone's got a question, feel free to drop me an email or schedule a time to catch up. I really appreciate you joining at this time. And thank you for those that watch the recording. Let me know if you've got any feedback. There'll be a survey. I think it shows up when this webinar finishes, if you want to hang around for a minute. Otherwise, I think it gets emailed to you tomorrow. Appreciate the time, guys. Thank you so much. Okay, catch you later.